Sometimes the calmest man in the room is carrying the greatest authority, and nobody realizes it until it is too late. The afternoon sun settled over the main entrance of Fort Liberty as commuters, delivery trucks, military families, and civilian contractors moved steadily through one of the busiest security checkpoints in North Carolina. Less than a mile away, a small shopping plaza buzzed with ordinary life. Parents carried grocery bags, teenagers laughed outside a sandwich shop, and retirees enjoyed coffee beneath oversized patio umbrellas. It looked like another peaceful American afternoon where nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen. General Nathaniel Brooks preferred it that way. At 56 years old, he had spent decades leading soldiers around the world, yet on his rare days away from headquarters, he dressed like any other American. A navy windbreaker covered a plain gray polo shirt. Dark jeans and comfortable walking shoes completed the look. There was no military insignia, no chauffeur, no security detail, and nothing that hinted at the rank he carried every day. He believed respect should never depend on stars sewn onto a uniform. He had parked his pickup truck several blocks away simply because he enjoyed walking. The fresh air reminded him that leadership began by staying connected to ordinary people. As he crossed the parking lot toward a neighborhood diner, Officer Daniel Carter noticed him from inside a marked patrol vehicle. Daniel had worked the area for nearly 8 years. He considered himself observant and decisive, traits that had earned praise from supervisors for responding quickly whenever something appeared unusual. That afternoon, however, he allowed assumptions to speak louder than patience. Watching Nathaniel from a distance, he decided something about the quiet stranger did not seem right. Instead of taking a moment to observe calmly, Daniel stepped from his cruiser and walked directly toward him with an increasingly serious expression. Nearby conversations began to fade as people sensed tension building between the two men. Nathaniel stopped walking the moment he realized an officer wished to speak with him. His posture remained relaxed. His hands stayed visible. His expression showed neither fear nor anger, only quiet curiosity. Daniel greeted him with a firm voice and immediately began asking questions about why he was near the installation. Nathaniel answered politely that he was simply walking to lunch. The response did not satisfy the officer. Each new question became sharper than the last. Customers standing outside the diner exchanged uncertain glances. A delivery driver paused beside his truck. A mother quietly guided her young son closer to her side while pretending not to stare. Nathaniel noticed every nervous face around him, yet his own expression never changed. Years of leadership had taught him that emotions often spread faster than facts. If one person remained calm, others usually followed. Daniel interpreted that calm differently. To him, it appeared unusual that someone under such intense questioning showed no visible anxiety. The silence between questions grew heavier with every passing second. Traffic continued flowing behind them, while the ordinary sounds of the afternoon slowly disappeared beneath the growing attention of curious bystanders. Nathaniel could feel dozens of eyes watching, but he refused to let pride enter the conversation. His responsibility had never been to win arguments. His responsibility was to protect dignity, including the dignity of the man standing across from him. Daniel believed he was fully in control of the situation. Nathaniel knew something entirely different. Sometimes the greatest test of character is not how loudly you defend your reputation, but how patiently you wait for the truth to reveal itself. Officer Daniel Carter slowly shifted his footing and spoke with even greater authority, convinced that complete compliance should come immediately. He instructed Nathaniel Brooks to remain exactly where he was while he continued asking detailed questions about his destination, his reason for being near the installation, and whether he possessed any official identification connected to the military base. Nathaniel listened without interruption. His voice remained steady as he answered every question that he reasonably could, explaining that he had planned to enjoy a late lunch before returning to scheduled responsibilities later that afternoon. He deliberately avoided mentioning his position because he believed character should always come before rank. Around them, the quiet parking lot no longer felt ordinary. More people drifted toward the edge of the sidewalk, pretending to check their phones while quietly observing the conversation. A retired veteran sitting outside the diner folded his newspaper and watched with growing concern. A young cashier inside the restaurant glanced repeatedly through the front window, sensing that something important was unfolding. Daniel noticed the growing audience, but interpreted their attention as confirmation that he was handling a serious situation. Nathaniel noticed the same audience and thought only about keeping everyone calm. Years spent leading thousands of service members had taught him that panic could spread through a crowd much faster than facts. He chose every word carefully, never raising his voice and never matching the intensity standing in front of him. Daniel continued asking why Nathaniel had parked several blocks away instead of using a closer space. Nathaniel answered honestly that he enjoyed walking whenever his schedule allowed. The explanation sounded simple because it was true, yet Daniel remained unconvinced. He believed that the quiet confidence in Nathaniel's answers suggested someone hiding important information. The officer requested identification once again. Nathaniel reached slowly toward his jacket before stopping himself. Rather than making any movement that might create unnecessary misunderstanding, he calmly explained where his wallet was located and asked if the officer preferred that he retrieve it. Several bystanders exchanged impressed looks at how measured and respectful the conversation remained on one side despite the increasing pressure. Daniel nodded cautiously, yet something still prevented him from trusting the ordinary explanation standing before him. The silence between each question seemed longer than the answers themselves. Wind gently moved the American flag near the installation entrance while traffic continued passing only yards away. Life carried on as if nothing unusual had happened. But for those watching, every passing second felt heavier than the last. Nathaniel briefly looked toward the distant gates of Fort Liberty, then back at Daniel. His expression revealed neither frustration nor pride. Instead, it reflected the patience of someone who understood that true leadership often required enduring misunderstanding without surrendering dignity. Daniel believed he was one question away from uncovering the truth. Nathaniel already knew the truth was standing in plain sight. He simply understood that revealing it too early would teach no one anything lasting. As another patrol vehicle rolled slowly past without stopping, the retired veteran quietly whispered to the customer beside him that the calmest people often carried the greatest responsibility. Nobody nearby realized just how accurate those words would soon become, because Nathaniel had already decided that if the conversation continued in the same direction, he would ask for only one thing. He would not ask for special treatment. He would not argue about respect. He would simply request permission to make a single phone call. Daniel Carter studied Nathaniel Brooks for another long moment before speaking again. The officer believed experience had taught him to recognize when someone was withholding information, and the composed man standing quietly before him seemed almost too calm for the circumstances. Daniel asked whether Nathaniel worked at Fort Liberty or had business with anyone inside the installation. Nathaniel answered honestly that his responsibilities often brought him there, but he chose his words carefully without revealing his position. He understood that titles could end conversations, yet they rarely changed hearts. If respect depended only on rank, then it was not respect at all. Around them, the small gathering continued to grow. A family leaving the diner paused beside their vehicle. Two construction workers stopped eating lunch from the back of a pickup truck. Even drivers passing through the intersection slowed slightly as they noticed the unusual scene unfolding beneath. The warm Carolina afternoon sun. Nobody spoke loudly. Everyone seemed to sense that something significant was developing, although no one could explain exactly why. Daniel remained convinced that persistence would eventually uncover whatever the quiet stranger was hiding. He politely but firmly explained that security near military facilities required careful attention and that unusual circumstances demanded additional questions. Nathaniel acknowledged the officer's responsibility with a respectful nod. He thanked Daniel for serving the community and calmly repeated that he had no intention of causing concern. His measured response only deepened the officer's suspicion. Daniel wondered why someone under increasing scrutiny showed no irritation, no defensiveness, and no attempt to leave. Nathaniel, meanwhile, quietly observed the officer's professionalism mixed with growing certainty. He had seen similar situations before during decades of military leadership. Confidence without complete information could easily become misplaced. The retired veteran sitting outside the diner continued watching with folded hands, recognizing something familiar in Nathaniel's posture. It reminded him of commanders he had served beside many years earlier, men whose authority never depended on raising their voices. Inside the restaurant, conversations had nearly disappeared. Employees occasionally looked through the windows before returning to their work, unable to ignore the unusual calm that surrounded the exchange. Daniel asked one final series of questions about Nathaniel's destination, employment, and purpose for being near the installation that afternoon. Nathaniel answered each one honestly within the limits he believed appropriate, careful not to mislead, yet equally careful not to introduce his position unnecessarily. After a thoughtful pause, he looked directly at Daniel with the same steady expression he had maintained since the beginning of their conversation. His voice remained courteous, almost gentle. He said that he understood the officer's concerns and appreciated the opportunity to cooperate. Then he respectfully asked for permission to make one brief telephone call. Before answering anything further, the request sounded so ordinary that several people exchanged puzzled looks. One teenager quietly whispered that it probably would not change anything. Daniel considered the request for a few silent seconds, believing it would likely confirm his own conclusions. He had no way of knowing that the next decision he made would become the turning point everyone standing in that parking lot would remember for years to come. Daniel Carter considered the request with visible confidence before giving a short nod. He believed that allowing one telephone call would simply confirm what he already expected. Nathaniel Brooks thanked him politely, reached carefully into his jacket exactly as he had described, and removed a simple cell phone. There was nothing remarkable about it. No special case, no government markings, no indication that the device connected its owner to some of the highest levels of military leadership. Several people standing nearby quietly smiled to themselves, assuming the conversation was approaching its conclusion. A teenager whispered that perhaps the stranger was calling a family member for help. The retired veteran remained silent. Something about Nathaniel's steady composure continued to remind him of officers he had followed many years before. Nathaniel selected a single contact from memory instead of searching through a long list. When the call connected, his voice remained calm and professional. He spoke only a few carefully chosen sentences. He identified himself, briefly described his location outside Fort Liberty, explained that he had been delayed during a routine encounter, and concluded by saying that there was no emergency, but that someone might wish to verify his identity through the appropriate channels. He thanked the person on the other end before ending the call less than 30 seconds later. Daniel watched with folded arms, waiting for disappointment to appear on Nathaniel's face. Instead, the same quiet confidence remained. Nathaniel slipped the phone back into his pocket and resumed standing patiently, without adding another word. For several long moments, nothing appeared to happen. Cars continued entering the installation. Families walked across nearby sidewalks. Inside the diner, plates were carried from the kitchen while conversations slowly resumed. A few spectators even began drifting away, convinced that the unusual encounter would end without any surprises. Then subtle changes began unfolding almost unnoticed. Security personnel at the installation entrance started speaking more frequently into their communication devices. A military police vehicle crossed the gate at an unusually deliberate pace before stopping near the checkpoint. Two uniformed service members looked toward the parking lot with expressions that shifted from curiosity to unmistakable focus. Daniel noticed the movement, but assumed it related to ordinary base operations. Nathaniel simply watched in silence. The retired veteran quietly stood from his chair. Years of experience had taught him to recognize disciplined coordination, and what he was seeing no longer resembled a routine afternoon. Another minute passed before a black sport utility vehicle entered through the installation gate, followed by a second government vehicle traveling at a measured speed. Neither vehicle used flashing lights or created unnecessary attention, yet everyone nearby instinctively sensed that something important was unfolding. The conversations outside the diner faded once again. Daniel glanced toward the approaching vehicles, then back at Nathaniel, whose calm expression had not changed since the first question had been asked. The officer still believed he understood the situation, but certainty was beginning to compete with curiosity. As the vehicles rolled closer and several senior military personnel stepped out with composed professionalism, the atmosphere around the parking lot transformed completely. Without a single raised voice or dramatic gesture, every person watching could feel that the next few moments were about to reveal a truth far greater than anyone had imagined. The first senior officer stepped from the lead vehicle with calm purpose instead of urgency. His uniform immediately drew the attention of everyone nearby, not because of dramatic movement, but because of the quiet confidence that accompanies genuine responsibility. Two additional officers followed several steps behind, each scanning the parking lot before looking directly toward Nathaniel Brooks. Their expressions changed the instant they recognized him. Without hesitation, they approached with disciplined professionalism. Daniel Carter instinctively straightened his posture, expecting that the officers would assist with what he believed had been a routine encounter. Instead, the senior officer stopped several feet in front of Nathaniel, offered a precise military salute, and greeted him with unmistakable respect. Every conversation in the parking lot seemed to disappear at once. The retired veteran slowly removed his cap. The waitress standing inside the diner covered her mouth in surprise. Even passing drivers appeared to notice that something significant had just happened. Nathaniel returned the greeting with quiet courtesy, then immediately lowered the formality of the moment by asking whether everyone had arrived safely. His first concern was not himself, but the people who had responded. The senior officer confirmed that they had received verification directly through official military channels and had come only to ensure that everything was in order. Nathaniel thanked him and calmly explained that there had been no emergency. He emphasized that Officer Carter had simply been performing his duties based on the information available to him. Daniel listened carefully, still trying to understand what he was witnessing. Before he could speak, another vehicle entered the parking lot. This time, a civilian representative from the installation accompanied the military officers with official identification already in hand. After a respectful exchange, the representative addressed Nathaniel by his full title, General Nathaniel Brooks. The words seemed to settle over the parking lot like complete silence. Daniel felt the certainty he had carried throughout the afternoon dissolve in a single moment. The man standing before him was not an ordinary visitor. He was one of the highest-ranking leaders connected to the installation, someone responsible for thousands of soldiers, and countless decisions affecting lives far beyond that small North Carolina community. Yet nothing about Nathaniel's appearance had announced that fact. He had chosen to walk through the afternoon dressed like any other citizen because he believed leadership should never depend upon recognition. The bystanders exchanged astonished glances. The teenager who had quietly doubted the telephone call lowered his eyes in embarrassment. The retired veteran smiled gently, as though an old lesson had finally returned. Daniel took a slow breath and looked at Nathaniel with completely different eyes. He realized that throughout the entire encounter, the general had never interrupted him, never argued, never attempted to use rank to gain immediate advantage, and never embarrassed anyone in front of the growing crowd. Nathaniel had allowed patience to speak louder than authority. That realization weighed more heavily than any public correction ever could. Standing beneath the warm afternoon sunlight, surrounded by ordinary Americans who had unknowingly witnessed an extraordinary lesson, Daniel understood that the true measure of leadership was no longer standing across from him in uniform. It had been standing before him all afternoon, wearing nothing more than humility, self-control, and quiet dignity. No one moved for several seconds. The remarkable silence carried more weight than any speech could have delivered. The senior officers remained composed, waiting for General Nathaniel Brooks to determine what should happen next. Their discipline reflected years of training, yet their respect for him was unmistakable. Nathaniel glanced around the parking lot, noticing the anxious faces of strangers who had become unexpected witnesses to an unforgettable afternoon. He understood that every person standing there would remember not only what had happened, but also how it ended. Turning toward Officer Daniel Carter, Nathaniel offered a calm expression instead of disappointment. There was no satisfaction in proving someone wrong. There was only an opportunity to strengthen the trust that every community depended upon. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly before meeting the general's gaze. Again, the confidence that had guided him only minutes earlier had been replaced by careful reflection. He realized that throughout the entire encounter, Nathaniel had answered respectfully, remained patient, and never attempted to embarrass anyone despite possessing authority that could have transformed the situation instantly. That realization stayed with him far more than the general's title itself. One of the installation representatives quietly asked Nathaniel whether he wished to document the incident immediately. Nathaniel paused before answering. His response surprised nearly everyone listening. He explained that accountability mattered, but so did fairness. Every decision, he said, should be based upon facts rather than emotion. He requested that a routine review be completed through the proper channels, exactly as it would be for any interaction involving military personnel and local law enforcement. There would be no special treatment because of his position, and there would be no public criticism offered in front of the gathered crowd. Several bystanders exchanged thoughtful glances. The retired veteran smiled with quiet admiration. He had served under commanders who demanded obedience, but the greatest leaders he had ever known inspired respect without demanding it. Nathaniel reminded him of those rare individuals. Daniel listened carefully as every word settled deeper than he expected. He had prepared himself for anger, for public embarrassment, or for an immediate complaint to his supervisors. Instead, he was witnessing restraint guided by principle. Nathaniel stepped one pace closer and spoke in a voice that only those nearest could hear clearly. He explained that every badge and every uniform represented public trust. That trust became stronger whenever people took time to understand one another before reaching conclusions. Rank could open doors, but character determined what happened after those doors were opened. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing each sentence. For the first time that afternoon, he recognized that the encounter had never truly been about identification or procedure. It had become a lesson about judgment, humility, and the responsibility carried by anyone entrusted with authority. Around them, the tension that had gripped the parking lot gradually faded. Families resumed their conversations. Restaurant employees returned to welcoming customers. Passing traffic flowed normally once again. Life appeared ordinary, yet everyone who had witnessed the exchange understood they had seen something uncommon. The greatest display of authority had not come from stars on a uniform or titles spoken aloud. It had come from a man who possessed every reason to exercise power, yet chose instead to demonstrate patience, dignity, and respect. The military vehicles departed as quietly as they had arrived, leaving behind a parking lot that slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Yet for Officer Daniel Carter, nothing felt familiar anymore. The afternoon had changed something deeper than a misunderstanding. He remained standing for a moment, watching General Nathaniel Brooks prepare to continue the ordinary lunch he had intended to enjoy before the encounter began. Nathaniel thanked the senior officers for their professionalism and dismissed them with the same calm confidence that had defined every moment since the first question had been asked. There was no celebration, no display of authority, and no attempt to remind anyone of his position. The crowd noticed that more than anything else. Several bystanders quietly approached Daniel after the military vehicles had disappeared through the installation gates. None of them criticized him. Instead, they simply exchanged thoughtful looks before continuing with their day. The retired veteran walked over slowly and rested one hand on the hood of the patrol vehicle. He spoke with the gentle honesty that often comes from age and experience. He told Daniel that uniforms could command attention, but character always earned respect. Then he smiled politely and headed toward his truck without waiting for a reply. Those simple words lingered longer than the entire afternoon. Daniel watched Nathaniel enter the diner alone, greeted warmly by employees who had witnessed everything through the front windows. Nothing about the general suggested resentment. He thanked the hostess, waited patiently for a table, and smiled at a young employee who appeared nervous after recognizing him. To everyone inside the restaurant, he was no longer remarkable because of his rank. He was remarkable because of the grace he had shown when nobody knew who he was. Daniel quietly removed his hat for a moment and reflected on every decision that had brought the encounter to this point. He realized that procedure alone could never replace careful judgment. Every person carried a story that could not be seen from appearance alone. The lesson reached beyond military titles or law enforcement responsibilities. It reached into every conversation where assumptions threatened to speak before understanding. Later that afternoon, the installation representative briefly informed Daniel that a standard review would still take place, exactly as General Brooks had requested. There was no anger in the process and no desire for punishment beyond what facts might justify. Accountability, the representative explained, existed to strengthen trust rather than destroy it. Daniel appreciated those words more than he expected. He understood that someone with tremendous authority had deliberately chosen fairness over personal pride. As the sun began sinking lower across the North Carolina sky, Daniel returned to his patrol duties with a noticeably different perspective. He greeted people more patiently during each interaction that followed. He listened longer before reaching conclusions. Small changes, almost invisible to everyone else, began shaping the officer he would become. Meanwhile, General Nathaniel Brooks finished his quiet lunch and walked back toward his pickup truck exactly as he had planned that morning. To anyone passing by, he appeared to be another ordinary citizen enjoying an ordinary day. Only those who had witnessed the events outside the diner understood the truth. Sometimes the strongest leaders never announce themselves. They simply reveal, through patience and dignity, what real authority has looked like all along. The weeks that followed passed quietly, but the lessons from that afternoon continued to echo far beyond the parking lot outside. The diner. The routine review requested by General Nathaniel Brooks moved through the proper channels with professionalism and without unnecessary attention. Supervisors from both the military installation and the local police department examined the facts carefully, speaking with witnesses, reviewing reports, and focusing on understanding rather than assigning blame before every detail had been considered. That approach reflected the same principle Nathaniel had demonstrated from the beginning. Justice was strongest when guided by truth instead of emotion. Officer Daniel Carter participated fully in every conversation. He accepted responsibility for the assumptions he had allowed to influence his judgment and never attempted to defend decisions that deserved honest reflection. His supervisors noticed something important. Daniel was not resisting accountability. He was learning from it. Training sessions followed, emphasizing communication, patience, and the importance of gathering information before reaching conclusions. Daniel attended each session with genuine commitment because he no longer viewed them as requirements. He viewed them as opportunities to become the kind of officer every community deserved. Several weeks later, General Brooks returned to Fort Liberty for another series of meetings. Once again, he chose to drive himself and walk through the surrounding neighborhood without announcing his arrival. The familiar streets looked exactly as they had before, yet the atmosphere felt different. People greeted one another with friendly smiles. Restaurant employees recognized him, not because of his title, but because they remembered his kindness. The retired veteran happened to be enjoying coffee outside the same diner and smiled warmly as Nathaniel approached. They exchanged a handshake and spent several minutes discussing military service, family, and the importance of leaving every generation stronger than the one before it. As they spoke, a marked patrol vehicle entered the parking lot. Daniel stepped out and immediately recognized the general. For a brief moment he hesitated, remembering everything that had happened. Then he walked forward with quiet confidence, greeted Nathaniel respectfully, and thanked him once again for the grace he had shown during their previous encounter. Nathaniel smiled warmly and asked how things had been going. Daniel answered honestly that the experience had changed the way he approached every interaction. He explained that he now took a little more time to listen before forming opinions, and that those small changes had already helped him build stronger relationships throughout the community. Nathaniel nodded with genuine satisfaction. He told Daniel that real growth was rarely measured by a single moment. It was measured by the choices people made afterward. The retired veteran listened quietly before offering one final observation. He said that medals, badges, and titles might tell people what someone had achieved, but humility revealed who they truly were. Both men paused thoughtfully. Around them, families entered the diner, children laughed across the sidewalk, and another peaceful afternoon settled over the neighborhood. Life continued as it always had. Yet for those three men, the ordinary setting had become a lasting reminder that the greatest victories were often invisible. They happened inside the human heart, where understanding replaced assumption and respect became stronger than pride. Months later, the afternoon outside the diner had quietly become part of local conversation, not because of embarrassment or conflict, but because of the lesson it left behind. People who had witnessed the encounter often described the same unforgettable image. They did not remember flashing vehicles or military titles first. They remembered one man who never allowed pride to speak louder than patience. General Nathaniel Brooks continued leading with the same quiet discipline that had shaped his entire career. Whether he stood inside a briefing room at Fort Liberty or walked alone through a neighborhood sidewalk, He carried himself exactly the same way. His character never changed with the audience because he believed integrity was not something a person performed. It was something a person practiced every day, even when nobody was watching. Officer Daniel Carter also continued, serving his community, but those who worked beside him gradually noticed subtle differences. He listened more carefully before asking difficult questions. He greeted people with greater patience. He spent a little longer understanding situations before forming conclusions. New officers occasionally asked why he approached routine encounters so thoughtfully. Daniel would simply smile and tell them that every person deserved the opportunity to be understood before being judged. He never mentioned titles, ranks, or names. The lesson belonged to everyone, not only to the two men who had lived it. One afternoon, several months after their first meeting, Daniel and Nathaniel crossed paths again near the installation entrance. There were no crowds, no military vehicles, and no unexpected surprises. They exchanged a handshake, shared a brief conversation about family and service, and wished one another well before continuing in opposite directions. The moment lasted less than 2 minutes, yet it represented everything the earlier encounter had made possible. Mutual respect had replaced misunderstanding. Humility had accomplished what authority alone never could. The retired veteran who had witnessed both meetings later reflected that leadership revealed itself in unexpected ways. Some people inspired others through commands. Others inspired them through example. In his eyes, the general had demonstrated that real strength remained calm under pressure, while the officer had demonstrated that real courage included the willingness to learn. Together, they reminded everyone watching that growth was possible whenever people chose humility over pride. Long after the parking lot returned to ordinary afternoons and the diner welcomed thousands of new customers, the true meaning of that day remained unchanged. Uniforms eventually came off. Titles eventually changed. Careers eventually ended. Character was the only thing that stayed with a person for life. That was the lesson quietly carried away by every witness who had stood beneath the warm North Carolina sky. The measure of a leader was never the number of people required to salute them. The measure of a leader was the number of lives quietly improved because they chose dignity when they had every opportunity to choose something else. He walked without announcing his rank. He spoke without demanding respect. And in the end, he reminded everyone that the strongest form of justice is not found in humiliation or revenge, but in the quiet moment when truth gives every person the chance to become better than they were the day before.